Lena left the office later than she expected that evening. She had stayed behind to finish a few reports, and by the time she walked to her car, the parking lot was almost empty. The sun was already dipping behind the buildings, leaving a warm orange glow that slowly faded into a soft blue sky. She took a deep breath before unlocking her car door, trying to shake off the stress of a long day. Wasn't tired in a physical way. It was the kind of tired that came from dealing with too many people, too many questions, and too much noise. She was looking forward to nothing more than going home, making a quick dinner, and watching something light before bed. The roads were quieter than usual. Most people were already home, and the few cars that passed her seemed to be moving at an easy pace. Lena turned the radio on, keeping it low. She didn't need loud music, she just needed something soft to fill the silence. She drove calmly, keeping both hands on the wheel out of habit. She was the type of person who always followed rules. Not because she feared consequences, but because it made her feel safe and organized. She was only 10 minutes from her home when she noticed flashing lights in her mirror. At first she didn't think it was for her. She checked her speed. She was well within the limit. Her seatbelt was on, her signal lights were working, and she wasn't using her phone. But the car behind her didn't pass. The lights stayed on, growing brighter. She sighed and pulled over to the side of the road. Her stomach tightened a little, not from fear, but from confusion. She had no idea why she was being stopped. Put the car in park and rolled down her window halfway, then placed her hands on the steering wheel. That was something she always did during traffic stops. It made the situation easier for everyone. The officer stepped out of his car, and even from her mirror she could tell he was already frustrated about something. His footsteps sounded heavy as he approached, and she saw him adjust his belt in an impatient motion. When he reached her window, he didn't greet her or introduce himself the way officers usually did. "License," he said quickly, waving his hand without looking at her. His tone was sharp and uninviting. Lena blinked, surprised by how sudden everything felt. Still, she nodded politely and reached slowly toward her wallet. "May I know why I'm being stopped?" she asked gently, keeping her voice calm. The officer let out a short breath. "You were driving too slowly," almost laughed out of confusion, but she held it back. She was following the flow of traffic, and even if she had been slightly slower, it wasn't something that would normally require flashing lights. She handed him her license, which he snatched without saying thank you or even glancing at her. He stepped back to his car, leaving her with her window down and the cool breeze brushing her face. She looked around, noticing a couple walking their dog on the sidewalk across the street. They paused and looked in her direction, curious about the flashing lights. She offered them a small half-smile to let them know she was fine. Even though she didn't quite feel fine, after about a minute, the officer returned. His expression hadn't softened at all. If anything, he looked even more impatient. "You know why slow driving is dangerous?" he asked as if speaking to a child. Lena swallowed quietly. "I understand, but I wasn't aware I was below the limit." "It doesn't matter," he cut her off. "You should be more aware. People like you cause problems on the road." The words "people like you" landed strangely. She didn't know what he meant by it, but the way he said it felt loaded with irritation. She kept her voice steady. "I'm sorry if I slowed anyone down, I didn't notice." He shook his head and clicked his tongue, clearly annoyed. Then he leaned slightly closer to her window. "Where are you coming from?" he asked. "Work," she replied. "And where are you going?" "Home." He stared at her for a moment, as if waiting for her to slip up or add something more dramatic. She didn't. She stayed still, hands resting on the wheel. "You know," he said, "most drivers get nervous during stops." He seemed to relaxed. She looked up at him, unsure how to respond. What did he expect? Was she supposed to tremble to make him feel more in control? She simply met his eyes politely. "I'm just trying to cooperate," she said. "I don't want any misunderstandings." He exhaled again, a quick, irritated sound. "Don't get smart." Lena lowered her eyes, reminding herself to stay calm. The situation wasn't dangerous, but it was uncomfortable, and she didn't want it to escalate. She knew people who would argue, who would get defensive, who would match his tone, but that wasn't her. She had learned long ago that staying composed was the best way to get through tense moments. The couple with the dog was still nearby. They weren't filming yet, but they were clearly watching. Another person riding a bike had slowed down too, curiosity drawing attention to the flashing lights. The officer noticed the small audience forming, which only seemed to annoy him further. He straightened up and looked around before leaning closer to her window again. "You sure this is your car?" he asked. "Yes," she answered softly. "You live around here?" he asked. "Yes." "What street?" she told him, and he narrowed his eyes slightly, as if her answer wasn't good enough. "You work around here too?" "Yes." Her answers were simple, but the more she replied calmly, the more irritated he seemed. It was as if he was expecting her to slip, to get frustrated, to challenge him. And the fact that she didn't was throwing him off balance. "Step out of the car," he finally said. She paused, not because she intended to refuse, but because she genuinely didn't understand why such a step was necessary for something so small. Still, she nodded and opened her door slowly. As she stood outside, she felt the wind brush against her hair. The evening air was getting cooler, and the sky was turning darker. The officer walked around her car, peering at the back window, the license plate, and the tires, as though searching for something wrong. She remained beside her door, watching quietly. He returned to her with a new question. "You have any paperwork for the vehicle? Registration?" "It's in the glove compartment," she said. "Go get it," he said. She opened the passenger door and reached slowly into the glove compartment, making sure all her movements were visible and clear. She handed him the registration. He flipped through it quickly, not even reading it properly before handing it back. "You know," he said, "you're making this harder than it needs to be." Lena blinked, genuinely confused. "I'm doing everything you're asking." He huffed. "You're giving attitude." She wasn't. Anyone watching could see she wasn't. But the more polite she stayed, the more he felt challenged. Some people confuse calmness with confidence, and some confuse confidence with disrespect. It wasn't her fault. But she could feel the situation tightening around her like a rope. A car slowed down and stopped across the street. A man in the driver's seat rolled down his window slightly, clearly observing what was happening. Another person pulled out a phone. The officer noticed again. His shoulders tensed. He turned to Lena. "Do you have any other ID? Something with your workplace?" She hesitated. Not because she didn't want to show it, but because she wasn't sure if it was necessary for a simple traffic stop. But the officer's expression left little room for argument. "Yes," she said. "I do. Let me see it," he said. She reached for her wallet again. Her fingers brushed against the small card she kept tucked inside. She pulled it out plain, simple, official. She held it between her fingers, but didn't hand it over just yet. The officer tapped his foot impatiently. "Come on," he said. "To me." She breathed in quietly, her heart beating with a new kind of weight.
Ow.
She knew what that card meant. She knew what it would change. She had hoped never to use it in situations like this, but something told her this moment wasn't going to resolve itself normally. She handed it over slowly. The officer took it with the same careless motion as before, glancing at it then freezing. His eyes widened just slightly. His posture changed. His shoulders dropped. Impatience drained from his face, replaced with a flicker of realization. He held the card closer, reading the words again, making sure he wasn't mistaken. "What? You work with?" he started, but his voice trailed off before he finished the sentence. The couple with the dog watched closely. The man in the car across the street leaned forward. Everyone could sense the shift, even without knowing what was written on the card. Lena stood still. Her expression calm, not triumphant, not smug, just steady. The officer swallowed, his earlier confidence melting into something else. He looked at her again, but this time it wasn't the look of someone who felt in charge. It was the look of someone who suddenly realized he lost his. His voice softened, almost too quickly. Miss. I didn't realize." Lena didn't respond. She didn't have to. He cleared his throat, searching for words. "I might have been a bit firm earlier." She kept her eyes on him, not with anger, but with a quiet understanding that came from experience. She had seen this reaction before from people who treated her one way before knowing who she was, and a different way after. She didn't say anything. She simply waited. The officer adjusted his belt again, but this time the motion was nervous, not frustrated. His hands trembled slightly as he held her card. Another car slowed down. Another person watched. The officer looked at the growing attention around him and took a step back, trying to regain control of the scene, but it was too late. Everyone, including him, knew something had changed, something he couldn't undo. And Lena, standing calmly beside her car, knew this was only the beginning of what he would soon regret. The street felt different now. It was the same road, the same cool air, the same soft hum of passing cars in the distance. But something had shifted the moment the officer saw Lena's work identification. His shoulders had lowered, his posture had softened, and his voice had lost the sharp edge he carried earlier. The change was almost instant, but not instant enough for the people watching to miss the contrast. A few bystanders exchanged quiet looks with each other, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Lena stood beside her car, her hands relaxed at her sides. She wasn't pretending to be confident. She simply had nothing to hide, nothing to fear, and nothing to perform for the audience around her. Her calmness wasn't an act. It was her nature. Years of handling tense situations at work had taught her that the best way to respond to pressure was not to mirror it, but to absorb it and let it settle without shaking you. The officer looked from her card to her face, then back to the card again. His breathing changed shallow at first, then heavier as the reality of the situation sank in. Lena could see the thought running through his mind. What did I just do? When he finally spoke, his words stumbled out as though they were trying to outrun each other. Miss, I didn't realize who you were. I apologize if I came across a little impatient before. Lena didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. His sudden politeness was already louder than anything he could say. The couple with the dog stood a little closer now, pretending to be adjusting the leash, but clearly wanting to hear what came next. The man in the car across the street rolled down his window all the way, leaning his elbow on it casually, though he didn't bother to hide his interest. Lena finally spoke, her voice steady but gentle. I understand you didn't know, but I don't think I gave you any reason to treat me the way you did here. Her words were soft, not confrontational, but they were honest enough to make the officer shift uncomfortably. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but closed it again, like he wasn't sure which explanation sounded the least like an excuse. It's been a long shift, he said finally. Lena almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because she had heard this kind of explanation before. People often thought long days justified short tempers. But she also worked long days, extremely long ones. And she knew how many people were affected when someone in a position of authority let fatigue shape their decisions. I understand long shifts, she said quietly. But I wasn't rude to you. He nodded quickly, too quickly. No, you weren't, not at all. There was a certain awkwardness between them now. The kind that came when someone suddenly realized they had misjudged a person completely. The officer looked around again, noticing more eyes on him. 2 teenagers on bikes had stopped at the corner, their phones half raised. A woman walking her small dog on the opposite sidewalk paused mid-step. The street was turning into a small stage. The officer looked like he wanted to disappear behind the nearest tree. He cleared his throat. I want to make this right. Let me just explain what happened. Before he could begin, Lena raised her hand slightly. Not to interrupt rudely, but to steer the moment away from becoming a defensive speech. Officer, she said, I don't want excuses. I just want fairness. That's all. He nodded again, slower this time. Yes, of course. She could tell he was overwhelmed. His hands were fidgeting at his belt, and he kept glancing down at the identification card as if he were afraid it might vanish and take his second chance with it. You said I was driving too slowly? She reminded him. He rubbed the back of his neck. Well, yes. I mean, maybe not that slow, but, and you asked me a lot of questions that had nothing to do with that. He opened his mouth again, then shut it. He knew she was right. And more importantly, he knew she had the authority to report everything exactly as it happened. Lena wasn't the type to humiliate someone. She wasn't enjoying any of this. If anything, she wished the situation hadn't escalated the way it did. But pretending nothing happened wouldn't help anyone, including the officer himself. He took a breath and finally said what he should have said at the start. I'm sorry for the way I spoke to you. It wasn't professional. Lena nodded once, acknowledging the apology. It wasn't enough to erase what happened, but it was enough for the moment. She opened her hand, silently asking for her identification back. The officer returned it carefully, almost delicately, as if worried he might tear it by accident. When she placed it back into her wallet, he stepped back a little. Let me write you a warning instead of a citation, he said, eager to offer something positive. You don't need to write anything, Lena replied calmly. Just let me go home. He stared at her, surprised. You don't want anything on paper? No. What would a warning fix? She asked. He looked lost for a second, then nodded slowly again. Right. I understand. The tension faded in the air, but the awkwardness stayed. He motioned toward her car, giving her permission to return to it. As Lena turned to open her door, the woman with the dog finally spoke, her voice cautious but curious. Are you all right? Lena looked at her and gave a small, warm smile. Yes, thank you. The woman nodded back and continued walking, though she turned her head twice more. Clearly still thinking about what she had witnessed, Lena sat inside her car, closing the door gently. She watched through the windshield as the officer walked back toward his vehicle. His steps were slower now, more measured, as though he was thinking carefully with each one. His earlier confidence was gone, replaced by something quieter. But Lena wasn't done. She didn't start the engine. Instead, she waited, hands resting in her lap. She wasn't waiting for him to apologize again. She was waiting for him to finish whatever he needed to do so she could leave without any confusion. She could see him in the rearview mirror. He sat in his car for a moment, staring at something in front of him. Maybe the dashboard, maybe nothing at all. Then he took his radio and said a few quick words into it. She couldn't hear them, but she could guess the tone. It wasn't the voice of someone giving a confident report. It was the voice of someone trying to keep his thoughts from spilling out. When he stepped back out of the cruiser and approached her window again, he looked calmer, but also more serious, ma'am. A supervisor is on the way, he said softly. Lena looked up at him. She hadn't asked for one, but she understood why he did it. He wanted to handle this correctly now, not just politely. That's fine, she said. He nodded, standing a bit straighter. I just want to make sure everything is properly addressed. His voice cracked slightly, and he cleared his throat. He looked less like a man afraid of getting in trouble, and more like someone who suddenly understood the weight of his actions. Lena could see the difference. She could see that this wasn't just about her title or her card. This was about him realizing that every person he interacted with carried a life, a story, and a sense of dignity. Minutes passed, but they didn't feel long. Cars moved around them, their headlights creating soft beams across the pavement. The teenagers on bikes eventually rode off, and the man in the parked car across the street drove away. The street grew quieter again, though a few people still watched from a distance. When the supervisor car finally arrived, Lena saw the officer straighten himself up again, but this time with the posture of someone preparing for truth, not performance. A tall man stepped out of the vehicle, adjusting the collar of his jacket as he approached. He gave a respectful nod toward Lena before turning to the officer. What's going on? The officer took a breath. It was clear he didn't want to lie, and Lena respected that. He explained the situation, but without the sharpness he had shown earlier. He explained that he had pulled her over, that he had spoken too harshly, that he realized he hadn't handled the stop properly. He didn't hide from anything. He didn't sugarcoat the details. He also didn't exaggerate to protect himself. The supervisor listened with a steady expression, then turned to Lena. Is that accurate? He asked gently. Lena nodded. Yes, that's what happened. Supervisor glanced toward the small handful of bystanders still lingering. Did anyone record? A woman down the street raised her phone slightly. I did, she said. The supervisor thanked her, then looked back at Lena. Ma'am, are you okay? Was there anything else inappropriate said or done? Lena shook her head. No, nothing else. The supervisor nodded slowly. All right. I appreciate your honesty. The officer stood beside him, hands clasped in front of him. looking like someone who was about to receive a serious conversation rather than a punishment. Lena didn't feel angry at him anymore. She didn't feel threatened or insulted. She simply felt tired of the long day, of the unexpected stop, and of the emotional weight that came with moments like this. The supervisor offered her an apology, and she accepted it with a small nod. "Thank you," she said softly. "Do you want to file anything formally?" he asked. Lena paused. She thought about the officer's sudden change in behavior, the apology, the honesty, the crowd that witnessed everything, and the fact that sometimes the best lessons came from being seen, not punished. "No," she said. "I don't want to file anything today." The supervisor nodded. "Understood." The officer looked at her, his expression filled with relief, gratitude, and something deeper, humility. "Thank you," he said quietly. Lena didn't say anything in response. She didn't need to. She started her car, checked her mirror, and pulled away from the side of the road. As she drove off, she could see the officer still standing there, hands on his hips, staring at the ground, as though replaying everything in his mind. And somewhere inside him, the regret was beginning to take root. Lena drove the familiar road toward her neighborhood, but her mind wasn't on the street signs or the quiet houses passing by. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the moment the officer froze. The way his face changed the instant he read her identification. It wasn't pride she felt, and it wasn't satisfaction either. It was more like a strange mixture of tiredness and disappointment, the kind that made her shoulders feel heavy. Even though nothing physically burdened her, she tried to shake it off as she pulled into her driveway. The porch light turned on automatically, casting a warm glow across the front of her house. She sat in her car for a moment longer, hands still on the steering wheel, the engine humming softly. Normally, coming home felt like a release. But tonight, her home felt silent in a way that made her sigh. Lena finally cut the engine and walked inside. She placed her bag on the small table near the door and went straight to the kitchen for a glass of water. She didn't need anything strong or sweet, just something cool to settle her thoughts. She leaned against the counter, staring at the tiled floor, replaying the officer's apologetic expression. His words hadn't been cruel earlier, but his tone had been sharp enough to leave a mark. She wondered how many others had experienced the same treatment, without a card in their wallet to shift the officer's attitude. She wondered how many people walked away from moments like that, feeling smaller, seen, or misunderstood. Lena wasn't angry, but she felt a responsibility settling in her chest. She worked with internal reviews for a reason. She believed in fairness, in training, in helping officers act better, not just look better on paper. She had no interest in punishing someone who made a mistake, but she did care about helping people learn from it. She took a long sip of water and set the glass down. Her house was quiet except for the gentle ticking of a clock on the wall. She went to the living room and sat on the couch, hoping a moment of rest would help her stop thinking about the traffic stop. But the more she tried to let the thoughts fade, the clearer they became. She remembered the couple with the dog, teenagers on their bikes, the man watching from his car. She remembered how the officer's voice changed the moment he realized she wasn't just any driver. And she remembered the supervisor's thoughtful expression. The way he had listened without jumping to conclusions. Lena knew she would have to write an internal note about the incident. Not a complaint, nothing dramatic, but a simple memo documenting what occurred. It was part of her job to report situations honestly. Even when she chose not to escalate them formally, she sighed again and reached for her phone. She scrolled through her emails, checking if anything urgent needed her attention. There were a few unread messages from work, but nothing critical. Still, she stared at them for longer than necessary, using them as a temporary distraction. After a while, she placed her phone on the coffee table and leaned back into the couch. The day had pulled too much from her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle around her. But just when she thought the night might finally calm down, her phone buzzed. She blinked and looked at the screen. It was a message from the supervisor, who had spoken to her earlier at the scene. She hadn't given him her number, so he likely looked it up through the department database, which wasn't unusual for internal matters. The message was polite. "Thank you again for your patience." I'd like to schedule a quick follow-up call tomorrow morning, if you're available. Nothing formal, just a clarification. Lena appreciated the tone. It wasn't demanding or forceful. It simply showed respect. She typed a short response. Yes, I'm available. She set the phone aside again, telling herself she would think about everything tomorrow. But she knew she wouldn't sleep easily. Not because she was worried she wasn't, but because she had seen something in the officer's eyes that lingered with her. It wasn't fear of getting in trouble. It was the moment someone realizes they've crossed a line they didn't even notice was there. The next morning arrived quicker than she expected. Her alarm sounded, though she felt like she had barely closed her eyes. She got ready for the day with calm efficiency, tying her hair back, choosing simple clothes, and making a quiet breakfast. She didn't turn on the TV. She didn't want background noise. She wanted space to think. At 9, her phone rang. It was the supervisor. "Good morning, Lena," he said politely. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all," she replied, sitting at her dining table. "I'm ready," cleared his throat gently. "I won't take much of your time. I just wanted a few more details about the officer's tone before you showed the identification." Lena explained the situation exactly as it happened. She didn't overstate anything. She didn't downplay anything. She stuck to facts, describing the impatience in the officer's voice, the unnecessary questions, and the tension that grew during the stop. The supervisor listened carefully. "Thank you," he said. "That matches what we gathered from the witness videos." "I appreciate your honesty," Lena nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I'm not trying to get him in trouble," she said softly. "I just want him to learn." "I understand," he replied, "and I think he will." There was a pause. Then he added, "He requested a meeting with me this morning. He said he needed to talk about the stop." Lena's eyebrows lifted slightly. She hadn't expected that. "Did he say why?" she asked. The supervisor exhaled. "He said he realized he'd let his frustration affect how he spoke to you. He said he felt embarrassed when he realized how it looked." Lena absorbed that quietly. She didn't feel satisfaction, but she did feel something like relief. Not every officer took accountability without being forced to. The fact that he was willing to talk, and talk honestly, meant something. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. "We're going to schedule a training session for him," the supervisor continued. "Not disciplinary, just corrective." Lena nodded again. "That sounds fair." After the call ended, she sat for a moment in the stillness of her kitchen. A gentle morning light spilled through the window, warming the room. It felt different from the night before. Lighter, less heavy. She picked up her notebook from the table drawer and wrote down a short summary of the incident. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was simply factual: what happened, when it happened, and how it ended. Once she finished, she closed the notebook and placed it back where it belonged. She had done her part. The rest was up to the department. She decided to take a walk to clear her mind. The air outside was fresh with the smell of early morning, and a soft breeze brushed against her face. She walked slowly, taking in the quiet of the neighborhood, the birds making soft noises in the trees, the distant sound of someone mowing a lawn, the steady movement of people starting their day. As she walked, she realized something important. The reason she stayed calm during the traffic stop wasn't because she expected anything to change. She stayed calm because she believed in her own way of handling things, no matter how someone else behaved. She believed in setting a tone of respect even when respect wasn't offered first. When she returned home, her phone buzzed again, not with a call this time, but with an email notification. It was from the officer himself. She opened it slowly, sure what she would find. The message was short, but sincere. "I want to apologize once more for how I spoke to you yesterday. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realize it wasn't right. I'm grateful for your calmness, and I'm going to work on being better." Lena stared at the words for a while. Then she nodded gently, almost to herself. She didn't need to respond. She didn't need to give forgiveness or advice. Sometimes the best response to someone's apology is letting them sit with their own understanding of what needed to change. She closed the email and set her phone aside. The day felt lighter now. Not because the incident was gone, but because it had moved from a moment of tension to a moment of growth for the officer, for the department, and maybe even for her. She looked out the window, watching a quiet stretch of road with no flashing lights, no raised voices, no uneasy stares. It was just a normal street again, and she hoped it would stay that way, for everyone who walked or drove down it. Not just for herself. The supervisor arrived with a steady, calm walk. The kind of walk that told people he had seen many situations like this before, but never wanted things to reach this point. He looked at the woman first, then at the officer, and then back at the small crowd that had gathered near the sidewalk. People tried to look like they weren't watching, but it was clear their eyes had been on the incident long before he got there. The woman stood just as calmly as she had been earlier, her bag still hanging loosely from her shoulder, her expression neutral but alert. She hadn't raised her voice once. But somehow, she was the one holding the entire scene together. The supervisor introduced himself, softly, and stepped closer to her. Not too close, not too far, just enough to show he respected her. Space. She nodded politely, and he asked if she could walk with him a few feet away so they could talk without everyone listening. She agreed, and they moved toward a quieter part of the lot, though the officer kept glancing over, clearly unsure of what was being said. He tried to stand tall, but anyone watching could see the tension in his posture. The moment he saw the special ID she carried earlier replayed in his mind like a sudden flash of lightning. It was the kind of mistake that felt small in the moment, but quickly turned into something impossible to hide from. The woman spoke in a clear, steady voice as she explained everything that had happened from the moment she was pulled over. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't add any dramatic pauses. She didn't try to make herself sound heroic or him sound monstrous. She just told the truth. She explained how she handed over her license, how he had spoken to her, and how things started to shift when he felt like she wasn't reacting the way he wanted. The supervisor listened closely, not interrupting except to ask for small clarifications. He took notes in a small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, the kind that had probably been filled with similar observations over the years. When she finished, he thanked her for staying calm throughout the incident. She simply nodded, saying she believed in staying professional even when things got difficult. The supervisor appreciated that. It was becoming rarer to find people who stayed composed when confronted with behavior that wasn't fair or respectful. He asked if she had any additional concerns, and she said only that she hoped the situation would be reviewed properly, and that the department would take steps to ensure other people didn't go through the same thing. The supervisor promised her that he would take it seriously, and based on the look in his eyes, it seemed like he meant it. After speaking with her, the supervisor motioned for the officer to come closer. The officer approached, his jaw tight and his steps slow. He clearly knew he was in trouble even before the supervisor spoke. The tension in his shoulders said everything. The supervisor didn't raise his voice, but the firmness of his tone made the officer straighten up even more. He asked the officer to explain his side of the situation. The officer began talking quickly, almost too quickly, as if rushing through his words might soften the details. He said the woman had been uncooperative, though he couldn't give an example of how. He claimed she had been delaying the process, though the supervisor reminded him that she had handed over everything he requested. The officer's explanations grew weaker the longer he spoke, and the supervisor raised an eyebrow at several of the comments he made. It didn't help that, from a distance, the people on the sidewalk were still watching, their phones still recording. Nobody was yelling or stirring trouble, but the quiet attention of the group seemed to add weight to the officer's discomfort. It was one thing to be corrected privately, but public accountability, even when polite, had a way of exposing the truth no one wanted to face. When the officer finished speaking, the supervisor paused for several seconds. He looked at the officer, then at the woman, then at the officer again. He had heard enough. He asked the woman if she would be comfortable stepping back to her car while he concluded the conversation. She nodded and walked away slowly, keeping a respectful distance, but still able to hear if needed. The crowd shifted slightly, watching her with a sense of quiet admiration. Many of them had been in situations where they wished they had remained as composed as she had. The supervisor turned his full attention back to the officer. His expression was serious, and his voice dropped to a low, controlled tone. He explained clearly that the officer's behavior had crossed a line. He talked about professionalism, respect, and the responsibility officers carried every time they put on a uniform. He reminded him that raising his voice, demanding things twice, and speaking down to people for no reason was unacceptable. More importantly, he emphasized that the officer should never have allowed personal irritation to guide his actions. The officer swallowed hard and nodded, but it was obvious he didn't have much to say in response. Any attempt to defend himself would only make things worse. He had made assumptions about a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong, and he had treated her like someone who needed to be intimidated into compliance. Now he was facing the consequences of that moment of carelessness. The supervisor told him the situation would be documented and reviewed in detail, especially considering the woman's credentials. He didn't raise his voice or speak dramatically, but the seriousness of the words hit the officer harder than any shouting would have. The officer felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He knew what a review could lead to: meetings, written reports, retraining, and possibly disciplinary action. It wasn't the end of his career, but it was a strong reminder that the badge came with responsibility, not entitlement. After addressing the officer, the supervisor walked back to the woman and thanked her again for staying calm during everything, apologized on behalf of the department, explaining that they valued respectful interactions and did not condone unprofessional behavior. She accepted the apology politely, but made it clear that she hoped the department would take genuine steps toward improvement, not just offer words. The supervisor respected her honesty and promised to follow through. Before leaving, she took a moment to speak directly to the officer, not in anger or revenge, but in a quiet, steady way that left an impact. She told him that she didn't want to see him punished harshly. She wanted him to learn from the situation. She hoped he would understand that the people he interacts with every day deserved the same respect he expected for himself. Her voice carried no bitterness, only clarity, and that made her words land even more deeply. The officer nodded, unable to look her in the eyes for more than a second. It was clear that her calmness, her professionalism, and the truth she carried held more weight than anything he could say in response. Sometimes regret didn't come from being yelled at, it came from being confronted by someone who treated you better than you had treated them. When she finally returned to her car, the crowd on the sidewalk slowly began to disperse. A few people gave her small nods of support, and one person whispered that they admired how she handled everything. She didn't respond with a big reaction. She just gave a gentle smile before closing her door. Her hands rested on the steering wheel for a moment as she exhaled slowly, letting the stress of the situation fade from her shoulders. The supervisor walked back to his vehicle, his notebook tucked securely under his arm. He knew that writing the report wouldn't be easy, but it was necessary. His job wasn't just to supervise officers, it was to make sure the badge represented integrity. He believed in the work, and situations like this reminded him why accountability mattered so much. The officer stood alone for a moment before getting into his own car. He felt the weight of what had happened pressing against him, a mix of embarrassment, regret, and a quiet understanding that something had to change within himself. He looked toward the woman's car as she drove away, and he hoped she would never have to experience anything like that again, especially not because of him. As she pulled out of the parking lot, she felt a slight sense of relief. She hadn't wanted the situation to escalate, and she certainly hadn't wanted to reveal her special ID. But sometimes people needed to be reminded that kindness wasn't a weakness. She didn't hate the officer, and she didn't wish him harm. She simply wanted fairness, respect, and a reminder that everyone deserved to be treated like a human being. Her drive home was quiet, giving her time to think about everything that happened. She replayed the moments in her mind not to dwell on them, but to understand them. She believed in accountability, not revenge. She hoped the officer would take the lesson to heart and grow from it. That was her hope, not just for him, but for everyone in positions of authority. By the time she reached her house, the sky had grown darker, and the world felt a little calmer. She stepped inside, set down her bag, and took a deep breath. It had been a long day, but she felt grateful that she had remained steady. She reminded herself that staying calm didn't make someone weak. It made them strong enough to control what they could. She knew the review would happen soon. She didn't plan to follow every detail eagerly or involve herself emotionally. She had done her part. Now it was up to the department to do theirs. She hoped they would make the right choices, not just for her, but for all the people they served. The officer, meanwhile, drove back to the station with far heavier thoughts than he had started his day with. He sat in his car for several minutes before going inside. He wondered how he had let frustration take over. He wondered why he hadn't stopped himself sooner. And more than anything, he wondered what kind of officer he wanted to be going forward. He decided that he wanted to change. It's not because he was afraid of the review, but because he realized that respect had to be his first instinct, not his last. He didn't want to repeat the same mistake with someone else. He didn't want to be remembered for moments of impatience or ego. He wanted to grow from what happened, even if it meant swallowing his pride. As the night settled in, both the woman and the officer found themselves reflecting in different ways. One felt hopeful that fairness still existed in the world. The other felt humbled, knowing he had been given a chance to do better, and somewhere between those two truths, the supervisor prepared his report, determined to handle the situation with honesty and care. The following week passed more quietly than Lena expected. Work kept her busy, as it always did. And she tried to settle back into her routine without letting the incident follow her around like a shadow. For the most part, she succeeded. She managed to focus on her reports, her meetings, and her usual responsibilities. But in the back of her mind, the memory of that evening stayed gently alive. Coming back to her in small moments, when she drove home, when she passed a patrol car on the road, or when she thought about the people who watched the whole thing unfold. She didn't feel angry when she remembered it now. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of closure, like a chapter had finished writing itself, even if she hadn't planned for it. She told herself that everyone made mistakes, and the important part was what they did afterwards. And from everything she had seen and heard, the officer was really trying to learn. On a Wednesday morning, her supervisor came to her office, holding a folder. He didn't look tense, just thoughtful. He knocked lightly on the door frame and asked if he could come in. She nodded, motioning for him to sit across from her. He placed the folder on her desk. "This is the final update," he said gently. Lena didn't rush to open it. She simply waited for him to continue. "The officer completed the corrective training yesterday," he said, "and he attended 2 additional sessions on communication and de-escalation. Voluntarily." She raised her eyebrows a little. "Voluntarily?" "Yes," he said with a small, approving smile. "He told the trainers he wanted to understand where he went wrong and make sure he didn't repeat it." Lena let the words sink in. She felt something warm in her chest, not happiness exactly, but relief. Growth was always slower than anger, but it lasted longer. Her supervisor continued. He also filed a written reflection. It was longer than required, and honestly, quite sincere. She didn't say anything, letting the information settle. The supervisor tapped the folder lightly. "There's nothing you need to do now. I just wanted you to be aware of how seriously it was handled." She nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate that." He gave her a kind smile before standing. "You handled that night with a lot of patience. Not everyone would have." When he left, Lena finally opened the folder. Inside were a few pages training notes, the officer's attendance records, and a short summary of the follow-up actions taken. She read through them slowly, appreciating the effort put into making sure everything was resolved correctly. At the back of the folder was a copy of the officer's reflection. She didn't need to read it, but she did anyway. His writing was simple, and at times awkward, as though he wasn't used to expressing himself on paper. But the sincerity showed. He had written about feeling frustrated during his shift, about letting his impatience spill into his tone, and about realizing afterward how his words sounded to someone who had done nothing wrong. He wrote about seeing the bystanders watching. It's about feeling embarrassed when he learned who she was. And about understanding later that respect shouldn't depend on rank or title. He wrote about wanting to do better, not because he feared punishment, but because he didn't want to carry that mistake with him. Lena closed the folder slowly. She didn't smile, but she breathed more freely. Everything felt settled now, not only procedurally, but emotionally as well. She put the folder away, knowing she wouldn't need to revisit it. That evening, She drove home again, same road, same turn, same quiet lane. She passed the spot where the incident happened without slowing down, treating it like any other intersection. The sky looked soft and clear, with gentle colors spreading across the horizon as she neared her house. She noticed a patrol car parked near the small community park a few blocks away. She didn't think much of it at first. Officers parked there often when completing reports or taking short breaks. But as she drove closer, she realized it was the same officer from that evening. He wasn't patrolling. He was sitting on a bench near the playground, without his hat, hands clasped together as if he were thinking. She almost kept driving, but something made her stop. Not curiosity, but a feeling that the moment was asking for closure, not the formal kind, but the human kind. She parked her car near the curb and stepped out quietly. The officer looked up when he heard someone approach. The hesitation in his eyes vanished when he recognized her. He stood up quickly. "Ma'am," he said softly, almost apologetically. "I didn't expect to see you here." Lena offered a small nod. "I live nearby. I take walks here sometimes." He looked at the ground for a moment, then met her eyes again. "I want to thank you, truly. Not just for what happened that night, but for what happened after." She tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean? I mean, you didn't file anything formally," he said. "You didn't try to get me written up or suspended. You just told the truth without bitterness. I've been thinking a lot about that." Lena folded her hands gently. "It wasn't about punishing you. It was about making sure you understood." His shoulders loosened at her words, as though a weight he'd been carrying had softened. He took a deep breath. "I learned more in the last week than I did in months of regular training," he admitted. "And it wasn't because someone yelled at me or threatened my job. It was because you stayed calm even when I didn't deserve it." Lena remained quiet, letting him finish at his own pace. He continued, "I realized I was letting stress decide my tone. I was letting frustration take the place of professionalism. And I didn't see how unfair that was until afterward." Lena appreciated his honesty. "Awareness is the first step," she said gently. He nodded. "I know I can't undo how I spoke to you. But I promise you, I won't let that be the way I speak to anyone again." His voice wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was steady, as though he had rehearsed the words in his mind many times before saying them aloud. Lena took a small step closer. Not intimidatingly, but kindly. "People make mistakes," she said softly. "Learning from them is what matters." He breathed out slowly, as if her words allowed him to release something he'd been holding tightly. "I'm working on it," he said. "I know," she replied. They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. Children were laughing in the distance. A few people walked by, unaware of the history shared between the two standing near the bench. The officer finally said, "I'm grateful you handled the situation the way you did." "I won't forget it," Lena nodded once. "Good." Then something positive came out of it. He managed a small, genuine smile. "Yes, it did." She stepped back and gave him a final nod, then walked toward her home. She didn't look back, not because she wanted to leave the moment behind, but because she trusted that the lesson had already settled where it needed to. When she reached her house, she paused at the door, taking a deep breath of the evening air. Everything felt quieter now, because life had slowed down, but because the weight of the incident had lost its sharp edges. It had become something else, a memory with meaning instead of tension. Inside, she set her bag on the table and turned on a small lamp, filling the room with warm light. She made dinner calmly, humming softly to herself. Each motion felt lighter than it had in days. Later that night, she sat on her porch for a few minutes, watching the neighborhood settle into stillness. The gentle breeze brushed against her face, and the quiet hum of crickets filled the background. She thought about the officer, not the mistake he made, but the effort he put into fixing it. She thought about the bystanders who watched, the supervisor who handled things with respect, and the simple truth that sometimes small moments teach people bigger lessons. She knew she had done her part, not by raising her voice or demanding consequences, but by choosing patience over anger. She hadn't intended to teach anyone anything that night, but sometimes life created lessons without asking for permission. and somewhere across the neighborhood, an officer sat in his patrol car, carrying those lessons with him, not out of fear, but out of understanding. He wasn't the same officer who had stopped her. Not anymore. Lena leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment. The world felt a little more peaceful, and she hoped the peace would stay. Not just for her, but for anyone who found themselves in moments where respect mattered most.